Hello and welcome to my first ever deck tech for the Snapdragons YouTube channel. Hope you've been enjoying our content so far. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Connor Mcgrath. I'm probably best known for being the first place loser at Calling Leon, where I was playing Azalea and I was taken down by Pablo Pintor in the finals. More recently, I played the Calling in Copenhagen on Ira last weekend, ending on a 9-3 finish, which earned me 23rd place, which was the highest placing Ira in the room. Unfortunately, since Azalea has been put out to pasture, I've had to find something else to play. And after some experimenting with various warriors and assassins, I decided that my dual-wielding home for now would be with Ira. As far as I'm concerned, Ira is probably the most pure and concentrated fab experience that someone can ask for. If you like the fundamentals of the game, attacking, blocking, understanding tempo, I think anyone that enjoys that will love Ira. There's a reason that she was the starter hero for the whole game, basically. So for the video in general, I'm going to go through the pros and cons of Ira, do a quick breakdown of all of the individual cards, then do a tournament report. So we'll start with the general pros and cons of the hero. I would consider her easy to learn, but hard to master, much like Flesh and Blood itself. She teaches the fundamentals of the game really, really well, like I said. And also her results, I find, reflect your mastery of the game quite well. So there's a direct kind of comparison between how good you are at the basics of Fab and how good you'll be at playing Ira. She's also very resilient to disruption because she can make use of smaller hands really well. So 2-card hands can represent really good value maths. She also has a pretty flat matchup spread, which is something that a lot of players, including myself, really like, in that she's kind of got very few auto wins or auto losses. Matchups are usually 50% win rate or better, as long as you're kind of prepared and planned for them. She just generally has quite good and consistent value numbers as well. So the deck regularly presents 2-card 8s and 9s. And you can also have some spike turns off cards like even bigger than that or dual threat. She's also just a bit of a nightmare to deal with at low life totals. So the classic kind of Kodachi lock that people talk about, where when people get down to single digits, they really have to respect the fact that with one card you can threaten 1 to 3 damage, and if they get down to kind of 1 life, they have to give you card after card after card for very little cards from your side. The last pro I have is basically just that she's very flexible when it comes to deck building, because the the kind of stereotype with her for a long time has been that she's not really a ninja. She's more like generics dot deck. You just play all of the best generics. And there's also different ways to build her where you can kind of have more aggressive angles, more defensive angles, more disruptive. So you can have decks like the one that I have at the moment, which is Kodachi midrange, or you can play Edge of Autumn lists like the one that Naib popularized in Singapore. And you can also have Flick Knives variants to the deck, which haven't been as popular recently, but I still think there's some merit to them. In terms of cons, she can be raced by some of the more explosive decks in the format in general. So some of the kind of quote-unquote unfair decks like Dash.io, Acilio, or Gravy, if you have a turn where you don't disrupt them, they can sometimes use a 5-card hand to just explode your life total down and make it so that your usual kind of tempo game is a little bit invalidated. She also has lower armor block than some other mid-range deck options like Warrior or Brute. I would say that she has quite a bad matchup into Warriors as well, just generally always has, with Valiant Dynamos acting as a kind of natural counter to her. She also has quite bad blues. The Kodachi resource base does require you to run 0-cost blues, so there's kind of a ceiling on how good those can be. And lastly, most versions of the deck can be quite expensive. There's just a lot of generic M's, but at the same time, you can transition those cards into other decks. They're expensive for a reason, because they're staples. So now I'm just going to move on to an individual kind of card value breakdown. I've got it broken down into categories. So the first one of those is equipment. Obviously, you're running 2 copies of Harmonized Kodachi. There's not a whole lot to say about the weapon. Generally speaking, your play patterns will either be attack Kodachi for 1 into Kodachi for 2 into continuing the rest of your turn. Or when you have a 2-cost attack, you do Kodachi for 1 into 2-cost attack for 7. And normally those 2-cost attacks have some sort of on-hit, which means that you're presenting a breakpoint as well, which is really good. On the head slot, we're running Mask of Momentum. This is core to the deck because it can let you keep tempo even if you don't have a disruptive hand. So your kind of basic hand with the deck is Kodachi for 1, Kodachi for 2, and then a 1-cost attack for 5. Normally that doesn't really do a whole lot, but Mask of Momentum means that if they don't give you something, you draw a card off of that, which is really, really good. In the chest slot, we're on Fiendal Spring Tunic. There's not really a whole lot to say about Tunic. It's just one of the most powerful chess pieces that's ever been printed. The most powerful things that you can do with it in this deck are basically on a dual threat turn, you can use your Tunic counter to finish with a 2 for 6 instead of a 1 for 5 that's been pumped by dual threat. Then arm slot is Tiger Stripe Shuko. The card blocks for 2. That's like literally all it does. It has so much text, but what it does for this deck is block for 2. And then in the leg slot, we have Pouncing Paws. This is actually quietly one of the most relevant pieces of equipment in the deck, I think. The card has so many use cases that have kind of surprised me and won me a lot of games. Its most common use is to enable a 3-card dual threat turn by going Kodachi, Tiger, close the chain, dual threat, and then Kodachi into a 1 for 5, which is actually for 8, and the Kodachi is actually for 4. All of which can then be done off 1 blue, so you can keep a really small hand and send back really good numbers. However, it can come up really, really big in the late game, because if they go down to 1 or 2 life, it lets you send Kodachi for 1, Tiger for 1, Kodachi for 1, and that can just close out games, and has done for me. In terms of other equipment, we just have 2 pieces of AB, Null Rune Gloves, and Tide Flippers. Not really much to say about those. They just come into matchups where you need Arcane Barrier. In terms of the main deck, kind of broken things down into different categories archetypes-wise. So first I'm just going to talk about all of the disruptive 2-4-6 attack actions that we play. So they're key inclusions to the deck, as they can be significantly more powerful in Ira, as I touched on before, because rather than being a 2 for 6, you can make them a 2 for 7 with their hero text. But even in instances where the on-hit, like the disruption side of it, isn't that relevant, they still present really good numbers in the form of a 2-card 8, which is kind of what you want to aim for. You want to try and get 4 value out of your cards in general. Most of these will only come into specific heroes that they're applicable to, but there tends to be a direct correlation between how many of these come in and how disruptive you are in a given matchup. So you'll see that there's kind of matchups like Dash.io, Gravy, Acilio. We bring in more of these because we need to stop them from playing the unfair game. First up is 3 Command and Conquer. This one is just generically powerful disruption. This is applicable in every matchup. It actually has some unspoken power in that some opponents will not want to arsenal as much against you because they know that you can send a Command and Conquer for 7, and it's just such a nightmare to block. Then we've got 3 Erase Face. This card, generally speaking, shines against the likes of Dash.io, Syndra, Acilio, and Fang. Just stripping the talents or class from those particular heroes is really, really powerful. Particularly Dash.io, it basically means they don't get a turn. Then we've got 2 Humble. This one shines obviously against heroes where they really use their hero text a lot. So the likes of Gravy, Prism, Dash.io to a lesser extent, KO it can be a bit of a pain, and the Assassins it can be surprisingly good against as well. And then to round out the 2 for 6 disruption category, we've got 3 Weakest Link. This one shines against the likes of Gravy, Dash.io, Acilio, and Prism. Basically, anywhere that it has text, it's good. It's also worth considering into the Assassins just for hand knowledge, I find, because that can be really good. And it's also a 3 block, and as I touched on, you can send 2-card 8s with it. You're often stripped down on cards against Assassins. Next category I have is kind of 1 for 5 attack actions. So these are mostly just in the deck because of their ability to represent a really good 2-card hand, in that it's also 2-card 8, but it threatens mask, like I mentioned before. So the 1-for-5s I have are 3 copies of Censor. This is probably the best 1-for-5 because it can represent disruption against decks that run a lot of copies of the same card. So something like Golden Tipple and Gravy, or Zipper Hit and Dash.io. As well as against decks that rely on a specific card to have a power turn, so something like Gone in a Flash in Acilio. Then I've got 2 copies of Sound the Alarm. This is probably the weakest 1-for-5 in the deck, which is why it's down to 2 copies. But I have found that hand knowledge can be really, really important in some matchups, and in those matchups as well, they often run attack reactions. So against the likes of Assassins and Warriors, it does have extra text because it can get you a D-React, which helps you to play on their terms, which is kind of the challenge those classes present. And then lastly is Torrent of Tempo. I'm on 3 copies of this. This one's a little bit boring. It is very, very short text box, but what it does is still really powerful. It basically lets you represent a mask trigger that will also have Go Again. So you can still use the card this turn. You're still threatening to do that. What it's particularly good for is it means that you can send this while you already have a card in hand. And normally people will ignore a mask trigger if you've already got a card in hand because the attack won't have Go Again, but they kind of have to respect it with Torrent of Tempo. The next category is turn extenders. So basically anything that has Go Again and can let you use more than 2 cards, because the 1-for-5s and 2-for-6s are great, but if you have a 4-card hand, they're kind of restrictive. So you need cards that you can use when you aren't given an opportunity to block. So the first of these is Bittering Thorns. This is probably one of the best uses for Tunic in the deck, because it lets you set up turns that can do Kodachi for 1, Bittering for 5, into then a Disruptive 2-for-6, which comes over for 7 if they let the Bittering Thorns hit. And just overlapping Bittering Thorns' on hit with a actual Disruptive on hit can be really powerful, because Bittering Thorns can bait out blocks, and then they don't have the cards to cover up the legitimately disruptive thing when you send it afterwards. Next up is 3 Cut Through. So there's not a huge amount to say about this one. It's a 0-for-4 Go Again pretty much all the time. There's very few decks that are going to regularly block out your first Kodachi. And that's just a really good rate. So it's a really solid extender. It can threaten mask with Go Again, which, as I touched on with Torrent of Tempo, is really powerful. Then we've got 3 Enlightened Strike. This one is a bit of like an extender asterisk, because it's kind of a Swiss Army knife of a card. It's one of the reasons that I just love playing with the card in any deck in general. But it does help you convert big hands when your opponent lets you have them. It usually blocks for 3, but sometimes it can come over for 7 if you're tight on resources, and it can also do very powerful things with even bigger than that, where you opt with even bigger than that, and then you can draw the card off of E-Strike, bringing us on to even bigger than that. That is also turn extender. This is a card that I have to say, I expected this one to be good when I saw it in Shoma's lists. That's kind of what inspired me to start running it. But God, it's been so good. I love this card. It's become one of my favorite cards in the whole game. And despite being a non-block, which is obviously awkward, it's also quite flexible, because it can let you keep a big hand and send all of it almost all the time, or it can be used to keep a small hand and kind of dig for relevant disruption. Next in terms of extenders is 3 Pain in the Backside. This is technically just a 0-for-3 Go Again, like a head jab, but its on hit represents a 4th value, so it's the best head jab, which is why we're running it. It can also, similar to Bittering Thorns, draw blocks, which will get you tempo, and if you draw blocks and then send a relevant disruptor, you basically dismantle your opponent's turn. You can also slot this one in as your second attack to make it 4, threatening 5, which is a lot more powerful because it sends over a breakpoint. It's a lot harder to block. And then we have Dual Threat. This is the most powerful card in the deck. It's technically an extender, but it's really like the card that you play towards most to close out games and kill people. It's the most aggressive card in the deck, bar none. You can normally get 6 value out of it pretty easily by just going Kodachi for 1 into the Tiger off of Pouncing Paws, close the chain, dual threat. Kodachi for 4 into a 1 for 5 for 8, and then that's like a 3 card. 2 plus 4 is 6 plus 8 is 2. 3 card 14, which is really, really good. But you can also use it on bigger hands where you can end on a 2 for 6 at the end, which comes over for 9, which is pretty disgusting. But even when you can't set up a go again attack to use with it, and you've already used your boots, you can still use it to send over like a Command and Conquer for 10 or something as your second attack, where you just lead with Kodachi, play dual threat, and just use it as like kind of a pseudo nimblism. And that's still like really, really powerful. Command and Conquer for 10 is very difficult to block. And then the very last technical turn extender that the deck is on is 3 copies of Whirling Mist Blossom. This one I say is technical because it's basically just for specific matchups, and that specific matchup is Gravy. It's obviously insane against him, where you hit him or an ally with a Kodachi for 1, and then you immediately have 2/3, depending on where you saw it in the turn, attack action that draws you 2 cards on hit. And then you can sometimes chain that into a mask trigger afterwards with a different card. The card is pretty absurdly powerful into Gravy, and one of the main reasons why I would say we have a favorable matchup there. There is some thought to maybe running it against Prism as well, but I don't know. It's a little bit more awkward to kill angels with it, and they're not always going to have angels, so for now it's just a Gravy card. Next category I have is just the 0 for 4 defense reactions. This one really kind of needs no introduction. 0 for 4 D-Reacts have seen play in Fab for donkey's years for a reason. They're just really, really good. So the 9 0 for 4s that I'm on, which is a lot, or it seems like a lot to me anyway, having been an Azalea player before, are 3 Flick Flack, 3 Shelter from the Storm, and 3 Sink Below. We're on 90 reacts mostly because of the prevalence of Assassin in the meta, but they also just present really, really good value propositions against aggro decks in general. In terms of Flick Flack, it's not the best it's ever been in this list, I would say. There's definitely been lists that have run the card that have ran more combo cards, but I do think even with only 12 combo card targets, the inclusion of it and the threat of being able to block a second attack for 5, even if you don't have a combo card in your hand, is better than the value that Fate Foreseen was presenting for me. And when it does line up, you get a defensive 2-card 9, which is pretty absurd value maths. Then 3 Shelter. This one is in most decks at the moment, and with good reason. It's just a really solid 0 for 4 D-React into a lot of matchups, but into specific matchups like Syndra or Assassin, it can represent a lot more with its alternative text. And then 3 Sink Below. The value of this card has been explained ad nauseum. But basically, 0 for 4 D-React with hand filtering is crazy good. I shouldn't have to convince you to run this one. Next are the kind of utility blues. So the way I would describe these are the blues that I actually don't mind playing. There's some blues that I'm playing just to kind of fill a role, which is the rest of the blues in the deck. But these ones actually do things when you draw them and need to play them. So first of all, we got 3 Rowdy Locals. This card is quietly actually pretty powerful. I got more out of it than I was expecting, especially obviously when you're playing against decks that are heavy on action cards, because then it is kind of a 0 for 4. It also is quite powerful when it threatens Mask. So you can threaten to draw the card from Mask and then discard it to Rowdy Locals, which is pretty powerful. Then we've got 3 Soulbead Strike. This is one that you're pretty much just playing because Gravy is a really good deck, and it's pretty good at ally clearing duty. But similar to Torrent of Tempo, it can sometimes at least make your opponent give you a card when you have a weak hand, because the threat of it coming over and getting go again and drawing a card off Mask might make them want to block. Then we've got 3 Warmonger's Diplomacy. This one isn't universally powerful. It's obviously only powerful against certain matchups, but against those matchups, it has impressed me quite a bit. So it can seriously hamper the likes of Gravy sometimes, Dash.io, Vinset, if you ever see one, and to a lesser extent, it can also hurt Acilio a little bit. And then to round out the kind of utility blues we're happy to play are 2 Snag. This card's even more specific. It's mostly only seeing play due to the prevalence of assassins at the moment. But it does have some other uses in other matchups like shrinking, felling of the crowns, or plow unders into Verdance or Florian. This is normally a one of in the main deck, just as your 22nd blue, and the second one will sit in the sideboard and come in the matchups where it does have text or you need additional blues. And then the last thing to talk about in terms of what's in the deck are just the combo blues. These can be literally any 12 copies of 0 cost, 2 attack, 3 block blues with combo, which is actually quite a lot of stipulations and just leaves you with 5 different cards, which are Dishonor, Flusterfist, Find Center, Seek Vengeance, and Winds of Eternity. You can run any number of copies of them. I'm running 2 of some of them and 3 of others. It's better to run all of them if you can, technically, for cards like Bonds. It's just 1 less card to take out of your deck than if you ran clean 3 ofs of a few of them. So that kind of rounds out the actual deck tech portion. I'm also just going to do a quick tournament report where I break down the various decks that I played against in Copenhagen and how those games went. So day 1, round 1, my first opponent was George Roger on Gravy Bones. He's a former UK national champion, so he definitely knows what he's doing with a pile of flesh and blood cards. Unfortunately, despite this matchup being pretty favored, I did actually take a loss in round 1. I think a combination of some rough draws on my side and some hot draws and some tight play from George gave him a huge health lead in this one, which I just wasn't able to overcome by the time we got towards the late game. And this one was a bit of a massacre, to be honest. But we did bounce back in round 2. I had a game against Jarl, played against an Iceman named Antonio. Shout out to him. And as was to be expected against Jarl, the game was super duper grindy, but Ira can grind value pretty well. And there are some kind of opportune cards that you need to make the most out of to make sure you don't get fatigued, like even bigger than that in dual threat. You just got to make sure that those lead to quite large turns. And I was able to do that. And with that, I was able to get a big life lead and get Antonio down to life totals where he had to start respecting Kadachis. And once you get down there, Ira is probably just going to fatigue you. And that's exactly what happened. Round 3 was against another Gravy Bones. This was a little bit of an inverse of the game against George, where I drew really, really well. And my opponent Nicholas didn't draw quite so well. He had some shaky hands. And it just gave me a gigantic life lead that I was able to leverage to just eat a big turn from him and just close out the game very, very firmly in control. Round 4 was our first bad matchup. I played against a Fang, nice guy called Jose. We lost this one. This one I'm still a little sore on because basically I think I played this matchup really, really well, and I do think that it's pretty heavily unfavored. But I managed to get him down to 1 and then lost to a gigantic Hunt's End attack. I only drew the 1 dual threat this game. I think seeing those is really important, especially given that even bigger than that is a bit of a dubious inclusion when they're running dynamos because they can potentially block out your first attack. So your main power card you rely on is dual threat, and I only saw 1 of them. I think if I saw a second one, I probably would have won this one. Round 5 of day 1 was against a Prism. Unfortunately, this was pretty much the quickest round I had. Unfortunately for my Prism opponent, that is. Fortunately for me. It was a fairly easy win. I had well-timed poppers and good aggressive hands that just put him down to life totals that he couldn't really deal with. The only Herald I think that actually hit me was when he had a Figment of Erudition in his pitch zone. So I knew he couldn't go get the most powerful Figment in the deck, and I was like, my turn's really good. I'm just gonna keep all these cards and hit you with them. My round 6 opponent is another player of note, Conrad Neva. He was the guy that ended up going on to win the Battle Hardened on the Sunday. So big shout out to him. We played a incredibly tight game, and this is the game in the calling where the pouncing paws interaction at low life totals mattered most. Conrad ended up keeping a 3-card hand going down to 1 life, which for me is a pretty big red flag that I might just be dead because I was only at 2 myself. What his hand ended up being was an up 6 and run, picking up his glaive, and then he sent over a Kiss of Death. Or sorry, he attacked with a Chilisra. That was what it was. Yeah, he attacked with a Chilisra for 5. And he's got 1 card in hand at this point, and alarm bells are ringing that it has to be Tarantula Toxin. So I managed to cover up the attack for a total of 10 by blocking with 3 cards and giving him Tunic. And then that way, even if he had the Toxin, I would take a total of 1 damage and go to 1. And Flick Knives were off the board, so I was safe in that regard. So he ends up arsenaling the card, and I sent back a hand of Kadachi Tiger. Kadachi taking 3 cards off him. He sends back the Chilisra, representing the Tarantula Toxin. I don't block at all because I have a D-React in my hand. He pumps it, I D-React, and then my last hand was just Kadachi, pain in the backside, dual thread into a big Kadachi, and that was enough to take down the game. So yeah, super duper tight game, really fun one, and congrats to Conrad again for the success in the Battle Hardened later. Round 7 was against a Syndra. This game was pretty good for me. I felt very, very in control at the start of the game. There was a turn where he sent back a really big Wrath of Retribution. I think it put me through armor down from like 24 to 5 or something. But I kept a 2-card hand. He was only at about 6, so he had to start respecting me with blocks. And I think once you've got Syndra in a blocking pattern as Ira, you're just hugely favored. So yeah, we managed to close that one out and finish day 1 at 5-2. So we scraped into day 2 despite the rocky start. Day 2 unfortunately started with a pretty rocky start as well, with a tough loss against a Dash.io player named Simone. He's actually one of the Team Emperors guys from Rome. I've played against a few of those guys in the past. Big shout out to them. They're all super duper great opponents, very sportsmanlike. And yeah, I had to stomach a pretty tough loss against him, where basically, like I touched on before, if you leave Dash.io with a 5-card hand and don't draw enough disruption, then you can eat huge amounts of damage. Simone at one point had a turn that was 2 Spark of Genius, put in 2 red boom grenades and a Cerebellum processor, sent over a gigantic swing. I gave him all of my armor and all my cards and still took 15. So yeah, there wasn't much I was going to be able to do about that one. But we had to kind of just pick ourselves up. Round 9 was actually a bye, which I thought was very strange on day 2, but I was on the bottom table at the start of day 2 and I lost, so it makes a little bit of sense. A lot of people would see a bye as like a huge boost, but I actually saw it pretty negatively at the time. I was very, very tired, and I just ended up kind of sitting down for an hour and thought I would be half asleep playing against my next opponent. And then my next opponent's name coming up on my gem kind of woke me up a little bit because it was one I recognized. Because round 10 was against another Gravy in the form of Jacob Clements. For those of you who don't know Jacob, he's currently, I think, 2nd on the World Tour points leaderboard. So pretty scary name to see. But was looking forward to playing against Jacob. I'd chatted to him a few times before. And in this one, I feel like my deck performed pretty well. Got to be pretty aggressive. carved out a significant life lead, but I did have some difficulty. Jacob still made it pretty close with a really big turn and made me work hard to kind of eke out the win. The game finished with a turn where he had a Swabby in play, and I was on very low life totals. I think I was only on about 2. And I sent over the Kadachi, and the Tiger from Pouncing Paws came up big again here because he was on very low life totals. I think he was only on 2 as well. Into another Kadachi, and then into Bittering Thorns. And the logic there was, even if he gets to keep his last card and send Swabby, I can give him 2 cards, and he's on 1 in the Kadachi lock on the way back. But luckily, it didn't go that far because he actually had a bunch of non-blocks in hand, and the Bittering Thorns was able to finish him off. So that gave me another win in round 10 and kept me X and 3. Round 11 was against an Acilio player named Emil. He was actually on the Calling stream earlier in the weekend. Real pleasure playing against him. It was a good game. It is a pretty similar matchup to Dash.io, where your role in the matchup is to try and present meaningful disruption pretty much every turn, because you never know when they might have a really big combo turn. Unlike Dash, to a certain extent, though, I think you're the aggressor in this one, where against Dash, it's really difficult to be aggressive because of the likes of boom grenades. But against Acilio, they don't have the same sort of tempo wrenching capabilities, so you can afford to be pretty aggressive and just try and keep them off kilter. I managed to go in with a pretty reasonable life lead to go into the end game. I was on about 14, Emil was on 4. He kept a 3-card hand, which had Gone on a Flash. He used his Lightning Greaves and Old Knocker, sent over Gone on a Flash 3 times, and one of the instants he had was actually a 0-cost Shock, which came over for 5 Arcane. So I had a really poor blocking hand. I had 2 blocks and an even bigger than that. So I ended up going all the way down to 4, which is not really where you want to be, because it's technically within lethal range on his turn if he can just play 3 lightning cards and 0-cost shock you. But luckily that wasn't the hand he drew. My hand, I kept 1 card and had an Erase Face in Arsenal. I sent over Kadachi for 1 into Erase Face for 7. And Acilio has a balancing factor of running a lot of instants, and he wasn't able to block it all out. So I managed to win that one and go into the last round, X and 3. And I was handed somewhat of a final boss battle in round 12 by playing against Brody Spurlock, who was also on Gravy. So having taken down the second in the World Tour leaderboard, I now had to try and beat the guy that was in first. But I did manage to take down the game, thankfully. This game was quite similar to the game against Jacob, but to be honest, I drew even hotter and saw some more aggressive hands. There was one turn where I managed to set up even bigger than that and dual threat, so I got to send over a CNC for 9 go again, which is pretty absurd. Not something you get to say every day. And yeah, that just gave me a huge life lead. And there was one other time in the game that is probably very notable where I had a pretty big life lead, but Brody had set up quite well, and he had a 5-card hand where I sent some go again damage. He took some damage down to, I think, high single-digit life totals, and I finished my turn with a Warmongers, which meant that all he could send back was Conqueror of the High Seas for 8 into a back alley break line for 3 off of like a 4 or 5-card hand, which was pretty good, and it just let me kind of eat all that damage and send back a turn that took all the tempo, put him into the Kadachi lock, and I was able to close out the game from there. So that's the end of the tournament report. Hope you enjoyed my kind of recount of times in Copenhagen. Event was super fun. For anyone watching that has not been to any of these kind of Calling international level events, can't recommend them enough. They're so much fun. And Copenhagen was no exception. So that kind of brings us to the end of the video. I hope you got some relevant IRA knowledge out of this. Hopefully learned something. If you've got any questions for me, please, by all means, feel free to comment. Or you can find me on X at Edge of Air, X/Twitter, whatever you call it yourselves. Or you can obviously come over to the Snapdragon's Twitter account as well. We'd be happy to chat with you there. So yeah, just all the usual kind of like, subscribe, all that stuff. And if there's any particular content you'd like to see in the future, please let me know. I'm very happy to make it for you guys. Thanks very much for watching. See you.